The promise came with Cameron's dying breath, whispered through lips that could barely form words after the massive stroke had stolen half his body and most of his voice. I leaned closer to his hospital bed, straining to hear over the mechanical symphony of life support machines that had become our constant companion for 4 agonizing days. Daisy. His left hand squeezed mine with surprising strength, the only part of him that still worked properly. Promise. Me. What, sweetheart? I'm here. Tell me what you need. His eyes, those green eyes that had looked at me with love for 44 years, were wide with something that looked almost like terror. Never. Go to Cypress Hollow. I frowned, confused. Cypress Hollow was the old farm property he'd bought in Arkansas 32 years ago, right after Claire was born. 600 acres of swampland and forest that he'd called an investment that never panned out. In all our years together, he'd never taken me there, always saying it was too run down, not worth the drive. Cameron, why would I go there? You always said it was just empty land. Promise. His grip tightened, and I saw tears forming in his eyes. Forget. It exists. The desperation in his voice frightened me more than the stroke itself. In 4 decades of marriage, I'd never seen Cameron look scared. He'd built his trucking company from nothing, weathered economic downturns, buried our daughter Claire 25 years ago with stoic strength that had carried us both through the darkest period of our lives. I promise, I whispered, brushing his gray hair back from his forehead. I promise I'll never go to Cypress Hollow. He closed his eyes then, and some of the tension left his face. Love you. Always loved you. I love you too, Cameron. More than anything. He died at 3:17 a.m., slipping away so quietly that I almost missed the moment when the machines started their urgent beeping and the nurses rushed in to confirm what I already knew in my heart. 8 months later, I was still trying to understand what had frightened him so much about a piece of property in the Arkansas wilderness. I'd spent those months doing what widows do, sorting through a lifetime of accumulated memories, deciding what to keep and what to let go. Cameron's clothes went to charity, his tools to his nephew Bobby, his fishing gear to the neighbor who'd admired his tackle collection for years. But questions about Cypress Hollow lingered like smoke that wouldn't clear. The property taxes came automatically from our bank account, $847 every 6 months for land I'd never seen and apparently never would. I'd found the deed in Cameron's filing cabinet, along with insurance papers for a house I didn't know existed and maintenance receipts for work I'd never authorized. Just let it go, Daisy, I told myself every time curiosity got the better of me. You made a promise. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while I was boxing up the last of Cameron's business papers, trying to decide what his accountant might need and what could finally be thrown away. The caller ID showed an Arkansas area code I didn't recognize. Mrs. Whitmore? This is Sheriff Dale Cooper from Cross County, Arkansas. I need you to come to the Cypress Hollow property immediately. The words hit me like ice water. I sat down heavily in Cameron's old desk chair, my heart suddenly racing. Sheriff, my husband made me promise never to go there. He's been dead 8 months, but I gave him my word. There was a long pause, filled with the kind of uncomfortable silence that precedes bad news. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm afraid I have to insist. We found something at the property that requires your immediate attention. Something involving your family. What kind of something? Ma'am, this isn't a conversation I can have over the phone. But Mrs. Whitmore, there's someone here who's been living on your property. Someone who knows you, and she's in serious medical distress. My mind raced through possibilities, none of them making sense. Living there? Sheriff, that property has been empty for 30 years. Cameron always said it was just abandoned farmland. Mrs. Whitmore, I need you to drive down here today if possible. The address is Ward 750 Old Cypress Road, about 3 miles south of Wynn. And ma'am? Yes? You might want to bring some identification and any property documents you have. This situation is complicated. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet of our Memphis apartment, staring at the phone and trying to process what I'd just heard. Someone was living at Cypress Hollow? Someone who knew me? Cameron had been paying those property taxes and insurance premiums for 32 years, but he'd never mentioned tenants or caretakers. I drove to Arkansas in a daze, following GPS directions through increasingly rural countryside until I turned onto a dirt road that wound through dense stands of cypress trees draped with Spanish moss. The closer I got to the coordinates the sheriff had given me, the more convinced I became that there had been some mistake. But when I rounded the final curve, I saw them. 3 sheriff's department vehicles, an ambulance, and what appeared to be a well-maintained farmhouse with smoke rising from the chimney. Sheriff Cooper met me as I got out of my car, his expression grim. He was a tall man in his 50s with kind eyes and the weathered hands of someone who'd spent time doing real work before pinning on a badge. Mrs. Whitmore, thank you for coming. I know this is confusing, but we need you to identify someone for us. Sheriff, I've never been here before in my life. Cameron never brought me to this property. Ma'am, that may be so, but the woman inside knows your name. She's been asking for you specifically. He led me toward the house, which I now realized was in much better condition than Cameron had ever described. Fresh paint, a well-tended garden, lace curtains in the windows. This wasn't abandoned property, this was someone's home. On the front porch, wrapped in a blanket and being attended to by paramedics, sat an elderly woman with silver hair and startlingly blue eyes. She looked to be in her late 80s, fragile but alert. When she saw me approaching, her face crumpled with an emotion I couldn't identify. "Daisy," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You came." I stopped dead in my tracks. "I'm sorry, but I don't know who you are." The woman smiled then, a sad, tired expression that seemed to carry decades of pain. "No, you wouldn't know me, but I know you. Cameron told me all about you. Said you were the strongest woman he'd ever met, that you nearly died trying to give him a child." The blood drained from my face. "Who are you?" She looked down at her hands, trembling despite the blanket. "My name is Lorraine Dufresne. I've been living in this house for 32 years. Cameron, he took care of me." "Took care of you how?" "He brought me here after—" She paused, studying my face with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "Daisy, I'm the woman who gave birth to your daughter Claire." The world tilted sideways. I felt Sheriff Cooper's hand on my elbow, steadying me as my legs threatened to give out. "That's impossible. I gave birth to Claire. I was there. I held her." Lorraine's eyes filled with tears. "You held her, yes. You raised her, loved her, were her mother in every way that mattered. But Daisy," her voice broke, "Claire was my biological daughter, and the baby you carried, your real baby, died during birth." I sank onto the porch steps, my mind refusing to process what I was hearing. "You're lying. This is some kind of sick joke. Cameron switched the babies. Your daughter was born dead, and mine was born healthy. He couldn't bear to tell you, so he made an arrangement with me." Sheriff Cooper cleared his throat. "Mrs. Whitmore, we're going to need to investigate these claims. There may be legal implications." But I barely heard him. I was staring at this stranger who claimed to be Claire's biological mother, thinking about my daughter who died in a car accident at 19. Wondering how many other lies my husband had told me during our 44 years together. "If this is true," I whispered, "then who was I? What was my life?" Lorraine reached out as if to touch my hand, then pulled back. "You were Claire's mother, Daisy. The only mother she ever knew. That part was real." But as I sat on the porch of a house I'd never seen before, talking to a woman whose existence had been hidden from me for 3 decades, I realized that nothing about my life was what I'd thought it was. Cameron had kept more than one promise from me, and some secrets, I was beginning to understand, were worth dying to protect. The ride to the hospital felt like traveling through someone else's nightmare. I followed the ambulance in my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles had gone white, while Sheriff Cooper's words echoed in my head like a broken record. "Mrs. Whitmore, we need to get her medical attention for the hip fracture, but then we'll need statements from both of you. This situation, if what she's claiming is true, there could be criminal charges involved even after all this time." Criminal charges. The phrase bounced around my skull as I watched the ambulance navigate the winding Arkansas roads toward the county hospital. What kind of criminal charges applied to switching babies 32 years after the fact? What kind of justice existed for a crime that had given me the greatest joy of my life, raising Claire, while simultaneously robbing me of the greatest loss, mourning my own biological child? At the hospital, I paced the waiting room while doctors examined Lorraine's hip fracture and ran tests to assess her overall health. Sheriff Cooper had given me space to process what I'd learned, but I could see him watching me with the careful attention of someone trying to determine if I was a victim or a potential accomplice. "Mrs. Whitmore?" A young doctor in scrubs approached me, his expression professionally neutral. I'm Dr. Martinez. Ms. Dufresne is stable. The hip fracture will require surgery, but given her age and overall health, the prognosis is good. How is her overall health? For 89, she's remarkably well maintained. Good nutrition, regular medical care, all her medications up to date. Someone has been taking very good care of her for many years. Cameron. Even from the grave, evidence of his secret life kept revealing itself in ways that made my head spin. Doctor, can I see her? She's asked to speak with you, actually. But Mrs. Whitmore, she's quite frail, and this situation seems emotionally charged. Please try to keep the conversation calm. I followed him down a corridor that smelled of disinfectant and floor wax, past rooms filled with people facing their own medical crises, none of them probably wrestling with the discovery that their entire marriage had been built on a lie. Lorraine was awake, propped up in bed with her leg immobilized in a contraption that looked medieval but probably cost more than my car. Her silver hair had been brushed back from her face, revealing features that were delicate despite her age, and her eyes, those startling blue eyes, watched me with an intensity that made me feel exposed. You came, she said again, as if my presence was somehow miraculous. I don't really understand what choice I had. I sat in the visitor's chair, maintaining distance while trying to process the surreal nature of our situation. Lorraine, I need you to explain something to me. If what you're saying is true, if Claire was your biological daughter, why didn't you ever try to see her? In 32 years, you never attempted contact? Lorraine's face crumpled with what looked like genuine anguish. Cameron told me it would destroy her life. He said you were a wonderful mother, that Claire was happy and healthy and loved. He showed me pictures. Pictures. Every month when he visited. School photos, birthday parties, Christmas mornings. He documented her entire childhood for me. Tears started flowing down her cheeks. He said if I ever tried to contact her, if I ever disrupted the life you'd built together, it would traumatize her beyond repair. I felt my anger building, a hot pressure behind my breastbone. And you believed him? Daisy, I was 25 years old and terrified. I had no money, no family, no support system. I was working as a waitress in Baton Rouge, barely making enough to feed myself, let alone a baby. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, as if she'd rehearsed this explanation countless times. Cameron offered me $200,000 to disappear. $200,000? Blood money, I know that now. But then it seemed like salvation. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at a parking lot where people were going about their normal lives, visiting sick relatives, dealing with medical emergencies that didn't involve discovering that everything they'd believed about their family was a carefully constructed lie. But you didn't disappear, did you? You've been living at Cypress Hollow for 32 years. Cameron decided he couldn't trust me to stay away. He was afraid I might change my mind, might come back and disrupt your family, so he bought that property and moved me there. I turned to face her, something cold settling in my stomach. Moved you there? Or imprisoned you there? Lorraine looked down at her hands, and her silence was answer enough. Lorraine, do you have a car? A phone? Were you free to leave whenever you wanted? Cameron said it was for everyone's protection. He said if I left, if I was seen in public, someone might recognize me, and the whole truth would come out. That's not what I asked. She met my eyes then, and I saw 32 years of resignation and captivity in her expression. No, I didn't have a car. No phone until recently. He brought me a basic cell phone last year, but only for emergencies. And Daisy, I haven't seen my driver's license or social security card since 1991. The room felt like it was shrinking around me. He held you prisoner. He called it protection. I sank back into the chair, my mind reeling. Lorraine, when Claire died in that car accident 25 years ago, what happened to you? Her face transformed with grief so profound it looked physical. Cameron came to the house that night. I'd never seen him cry before, but he stood in my living room and sobbed like a broken child. He said, Lorraine, I lost our daughter today, and you never got to know her. Our daughter, I repeated. He brought me the newspaper clipping about the accident. Let me read about Claire's funeral, about the scholarship fund you established in her name, about how beloved she was by her friends and teachers. Lorraine wiped her eyes with a tissue from the bedside table. I mourned her from that farmhouse, Daisy. I mourned a daughter I'd given birth to but never raised, who died believing another woman was her mother. And you never resented me for that? Lorraine was quiet for a long time, considering her answer carefully. I resented the situation. I resented Cameron for creating it. But Daisy, how could I resent you? You loved Claire with everything you had. You were the mother she deserved, the mother I could never have been at 25. I thought about Claire's childhood, about the bedtime stories and soccer games and homework help and teenage drama that had filled our house with life and love. About the way she'd hugged me goodbye the morning she left for college, promising to call every Sunday. About the phone call from the hospital that had shattered our world when a drunk driver ran a red light and took our daughter from us in an instant. But I wasn't her real mother. Yes, you were. Lorraine's voice was fierce now, stronger than I'd heard it since we'd met. Biology doesn't make someone a mother, Daisy. Love does. Sacrifice does. Being there when they're sick, celebrating when they succeed, holding them when their hearts break, that's what makes someone a mother. Then what does that make you? A woman who made a terrible choice because she was young and scared and convinced by a desperate man that it was the right thing to do. She paused, studying my face. And a woman who spent 32 years paying for that choice. Sheriff Cooper appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. Mrs. Whitmore, could I speak with you privately for a moment? I followed him into the hallway, leaving Lorraine alone with her hip fracture and her 3 decades of secrets. Mrs. Whitmore, I've been making some calls. I need to ask you directly. Did you know about any of this? About Ms. Dufresne living on your property? About the circumstances surrounding your daughter's birth? Sheriff? 8 hours ago, I thought my husband had been faithfully married to me for 44 years and that I'd given birth to our daughter in 1993. I'm learning that apparently I don't know anything about my own life. I believe you. But ma'am, we're going to need to investigate this thoroughly. If what Ms. Dufresne is saying is true, there were multiple crimes committed, kidnapping, false imprisonment, document fraud, possibly others. Sheriff, everyone involved is either dead or in that hospital room. What exactly are you planning to investigate? The truth, Mrs. Whitmore. You deserve to know what really happened to your daughter, your biological daughter. As he walked away, I realized that discovering Lorraine's existence was just the beginning. Somewhere in the wreckage of Cameron's secrets lay the story of another baby, my baby, whose fate I'd never learned because I'd never known she existed. Some truths I was beginning to understand came with obligations, and some obligations were more terrifying than ignorance. I drove home from the hospital in a fog, my mind struggling to process everything that had happened while my hands operated the car through muscle memory. Sheriff Cooper had promised to call me the next day to discuss the investigation, and the hospital had assured me that Lorraine would be stable until her hip surgery could be scheduled. But as I crossed the state line back into Tennessee, I realized that going home meant confronting whatever other secrets Cameron had hidden in our apartment. Our apartment. The phrase felt strange now. Had it ever really been ours when one half of the partnership had been living a completely fabricated life? I unlocked the front door and stood in the entryway, looking at the home I'd shared with Cameron for the last 15 years since we'd downsized from our family house. Everything looked exactly the same. His reading chair still positioned next to the window, his coffee mug still sitting in the dish drainer from the morning 8 months ago when he'd collapsed in the kitchen. But somehow it all felt like props in a play I'd been performing without knowing I was on stage. I walked directly to Cameron's closet, the only area of our home that I hadn't thoroughly gone through during my months of widow's housekeeping. I'd saved it for last, knowing that handling his clothes and personal items would be the most emotionally difficult part of settling his estate. Now, I attacked his belongings with the systematic precision that had made me a good obstetric nurse for 30 years before retirement. I pulled everything out of the closet: suits, casual clothes, shoes, boxes of papers, a tackle box filled with fishing lures, and spread it all across our bedroom floor. It was behind the stack of winter coats, in a section of the closet I rarely accessed, that I found the metal file box wedged between the back wall and a shelf bracket. The box was locked, secured with a small padlock that looked substantial enough to require bolt cutters. I carried it to the kitchen and attacked the lock with a hammer and screwdriver, not caring about finesse. The lock gave way with a satisfying crack, and I opened the box to find it filled with documents that made my hands shake as I read them. The first item was a birth certificate for Claire Whitmore, dated March 14, 1993, listing Cameron Whitmore and Daisy Whitmore as parents. But the paper felt wrong. Too new, too pristine for a document that should have been 32 years old, and at the bottom I could see the faint impression of an official stamp that had been partially erased and replaced. Beneath it was another birth certificate, this one yellowed with age and bearing the unmistakable signs of being an original document. Claire Dufresne, born March 7, 1993, to Lorraine Dufresne and Cameron Whitmore, March 7th. A full week before the date I'd always celebrated as Claire's birthday. With trembling hands, I pulled out the rest of the documents. Medical records from Baptist Memorial Hospital in Memphis, dated March 14, 1993. The patient name read Daisy Whitmore, and the diagnosis made my vision blur with tears. Intrauterine fetal demise, cord strangulation, estimated fetal death 24-48 hours prior to delivery. Patient experienced severe postpartum hemorrhage requiring emergency transfusion. Patient unconscious for 72 hours following delivery. I read the report 3 times before the medical terminology fully penetrated my shock. My baby had died in the womb, probably 2 days before I went into labor. The strangulation had occurred so late in pregnancy that I hadn't noticed the lack of movement, or if I had, I'd attributed it to normal late pregnancy changes, and I'd nearly died delivering her. Beneath the medical records were handwritten notebooks, dozens of them, filled with Cameron's careful penmanship. I opened the first one, dated March 1993. Brought Lorraine to Cypress Hollow today. She cried when I showed her the property, said it looked like a prison. I told her it was temporary, that once the adoption paperwork was finalized and Daisy recovered fully, she could leave with her money and start over somewhere else. But I know I can't let her go. She could destroy everything. I flipped through pages chronicling 32 years of what Cameron had apparently considered monthly status reports on his management of Lorraine's captivity. April 1993. Brought groceries and Claire's 1-month photos. Lorraine wanted to know if Daisy was breastfeeding successfully. I told her yes, that Daisy had no idea Claire wasn't biologically hers. Lorraine asked again when she could leave. I changed the subject. December 1995. Lorraine asked for Christmas presents for Claire. I explained that would be inappropriate, that she needed to accept her role as donor, not mother. She cried for an hour. I left the groceries and came home. September 1998. Claire started kindergarten. Showed Lorraine the pictures of her first day of school. Lorraine said she looked like her own mother at that age. I reminded her that Claire is Daisy's daughter now, that genetics don't matter. Lorraine has been reading more books lately, philosophy, psychology. I may need to monitor her reading material. June 2006. Claire graduated high school. Lorraine asked if she could attend the ceremony, promised she would sit in the back and not make contact. I told her absolutely not. She said 13 years was long enough, that she wanted to see her daughter graduate. I reminded her that our agreement was binding and that violating it would result in serious legal consequences for everyone involved. The notebooks continued chronologically, documenting Cameron's monthly visits to Cypress Hollow, his delivery of supplies and Claire's photos, his careful management of what he clearly saw as a dangerous situation that required constant monitoring. But it was the final notebook, with entries from just before Cameron's death, that contained the information that made me drop the book and rush to the bathroom to vomit. February 2023. Lorraine is getting weaker. She's 89 and showing signs of cognitive decline. Asked me again what happens to her when I die, whether I've made provisions for her care. I haven't. If I tell Daisy about Lorraine, I have to tell her about the baby switch. If I don't tell Daisy, Lorraine dies alone in that house. March 2023. Had another stroke warning today. TIA, doctor called it. Daisy doesn't know how serious it was. I need to decide what to do about Lorraine before I die, but I can't bear the thought of Daisy learning what I did. Maybe it would be kinder to let Lorraine die in that house. At least then Daisy would never have to know that Claire wasn't biologically hers. April 2023. Dr. Martinez says the next stroke could be fatal. I should tell Daisy everything, but every time I try to start the conversation, I see her face when she talks about Claire, how much joy she still gets from her memories. How can I tell her that those memories are based on a lie? How can I tell her that her real daughter died and I never even told her so she could grieve? I sat on the bathroom floor, leaning against the bathtub, trying to process the magnitude of Cameron's deception. For 32 years, he'd maintained 2 completely separate lives, devoted husband and father in Memphis, and warden of a woman he'd essentially kidnapped to protect his secret. But the most devastating revelation was still in that final notebook entry, written in Cameron's increasingly shaky handwriting just weeks before his death. I buried our real daughter myself, paid the hospital crematory supervisor to incinerate her body without paperwork, without records. I told Daisy the baby had been taken care of, that she didn't need to worry about funeral arrangements while she was recovering. She was so weak, so grateful that I was handling everything. She never asked for details. Our daughter never had a name, never had a funeral, never had a grave. She existed for 9 months in Daisy's womb, and then, nothing. Like she never existed at all. I robbed Daisy of the chance to grieve her real child. I robbed our biological daughter of acknowledgement, of recognition, of love, and I gave Daisy another woman's child to love instead. I am a monster. I closed the notebook and sat in the silence of our apartment, surrounded by the evidence of the most elaborate deception I'd ever encountered. Cameron hadn't just lied to me about one thing. He'd constructed an entire alternate reality and maintained it for over 3 decades. My real daughter, my biological child, had died in my womb and been incinerated like medical waste while I lay unconscious in a hospital bed. She'd never been held, never been named, never been mourned because I'd never known she existed. And Lorraine's daughter, the child I'd raised and loved and lost to a car accident, had been given to me as a replacement for the baby I'd never known I'd lost. I thought about Claire's funeral, about standing beside her grave and promising I'd love her forever, never knowing I was mourning a child who wasn't biologically mine, while my own biological daughter had never even received the dignity of a burial. Some betrayals, I was beginning to understand, were so complete that they rewrote the past as well as the present. And some secrets were so carefully constructed that discovering them felt like learning that gravity worked backwards, or that the sun rose in the west. Tomorrow, I would call Sheriff Cooper and tell him what I'd found. We would begin an investigation into crimes that had no living perpetrators and victims who were beyond the reach of justice. But tonight, I would sit in the apartment I'd shared with a stranger and try to figure out who I'd been for the past 32 years and who I was supposed to be now that I knew the truth. Some widows grieve the loss of their husbands. I was grieving the loss of my entire understanding of my own life. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at Cameron's desk with the notebook spread before me, reading 32 years of carefully documented deception by the light of his old banker's lamp. Each entry was like a small knife wound, precise and clinical, in its description of how he'd managed what he clearly saw as a complicated logistical problem, rather than the systematic destruction of multiple lives. By dawn, I'd constructed a timeline that made my stomach clench, with a mixture of grief and rage. March 7, 1993. Lorraine gives birth to a healthy daughter at Baptist Memorial Hospital. Cameron is listed as the father. He pays Dr. Marcus Brennan, an old college friend with gambling debts, to falsify records and arrange the switch. March 14, 1993. I deliver my daughter, already dead from cord strangulation. Cameron arranges for her body to be cremated without paperwork while I'm unconscious from blood loss. When I wake up, he places Lorraine's living baby in my arms and tells me she's mine. March 15, 1993. Cameron gives Lorraine $200,000 and moves her to Cypress Hollow, telling her it's temporary until the adoption is finalized. The adoption that never happened because Cameron never intended to let her go. I found the receipts in another box, hidden behind winter boots. 32 years of monthly supplies delivered to Cypress Hollow. Groceries, medication, books, clothing, all carefully cataloged and paid for with cash. Cameron had budgeted for Lorraine's imprisonment the same way other people budgeted for car payments. But it was the photographs that broke my heart completely. Hundreds of them, organized chronologically in photo albums that Cameron had apparently shared with Lorraine during his monthly visits. Claire as a baby, learning to walk, first day of kindergarten, piano recitals, softball games, high school graduation, college acceptance letter. An entire childhood documented for a woman who'd been forced to watch her daughter's life from a distance while imprisoned on a farm in Arkansas. At the bottom of the last photo album, I found something that made my hands shake. A letter addressed to me in Lorraine's careful handwriting, dated just 1 month before Cameron's death. Dear Daisy, you don't know me, but I know everything about you. Cameron has told me about your kindness, your strength, your dedication to our daughter. Yes, our daughter. Because while I gave birth to Claire, you raised her, loved her, shaped her into the remarkable young woman she became before that terrible accident. I'm writing this letter knowing you may never read it, knowing that Cameron will probably destroy it rather than face the consequences of what he did to both of us. But I need you to know that I don't hate you. How could I hate the woman who gave my daughter everything I couldn't provide? I was 25 and broken when Claire was born. I had no money, no family, no ability to care for a child properly. Cameron convinced me that giving her to you was the right choice, that you would love her in ways I never could. And he was right about that. But Daisy, what he didn't tell you, what he couldn't bear to tell you, was that your own daughter died that same week. Your real biological daughter. He switched them without your knowledge, letting you believe you were raising your own child when you were actually loving mine. I've spent 32 years in this house, watching my daughter grow up through photographs while you raised her with the love and stability she deserved. It's been torture and blessing combined, knowing she was safe and happy, but being unable to hold her, to tell her I loved her, to be part of her life in any way. Cameron tells me that you still grieve Claire's death every day, that losing her nearly destroyed you. I grieve her too, Daisy, every single day. I grieve the daughter I gave birth to but never knew, the young woman who died, believing another woman was her mother. If you're reading this, Cameron is probably dead, and you've discovered his secret. I hope you can find it in your heart not to hate me for my part in this deception. I was young and scared, and convinced that I was doing the right thing for everyone involved. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect anything from you. But I wanted you to know that every day for 32 years, I've been grateful that Claire had you as her mother. You gave her everything I couldn't. You loved her the way every child deserves to be loved. Your biological daughter, the one who died, Cameron never told you about her, never let you grieve her properly. That's another crime he committed against you, another loss he stole from you by his silence. If we ever meet, I want you to know that I consider you Claire's real mother. Biology doesn't make someone a parent. Love does. Sacrifice does. Being there when it matters does. And you did all of that for my daughter when I couldn't. Thank you for raising her. Thank you for loving her. Thank you for being the mother I wish I could have been. With respect and gratitude, Lorraine Dufresne P.S. There's something else you should know. In the house at Cypress Hollow, in the bedroom closet, there's a box containing every letter I ever wrote to Claire, but never sent. 32 years of birthday wishes, graduation congratulations, Christmas cards, and just letters telling her about my day, about what I was reading, about how proud I was of her accomplishments. Cameron never let me send them, but I kept writing them anyway. If anything happens to me, I want Claire to know that she was loved by the woman who gave birth to her, even if she never knew I existed. I set the letter down and stared at the wall, trying to process the depth of suffering that Cameron's choices had caused. He hadn't just deceived me. He'd created a prison for Lorraine where she'd spent 3 decades loving a daughter from a distance, writing letters she couldn't send, watching a life she couldn't participate in. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Sheriff Cooper's name appeared on the caller ID. Mrs. Whitmore, I hope you're doing all right after yesterday. I know this has been a shock. Sheriff, I found some things. Documents, notebooks, records. Cameron documented everything. What kind of everything? The baby switch, the payments to the doctor, 32 years of maintaining Lorraine at Cypress Hollow. It's all here in writing. A long pause. Mrs. Whitmore, I need you to preserve all of that evidence. Don't touch anything else until we can get there to collect it properly. Sheriff, there's something else. My real daughter, my biological daughter. Cameron had her cremated without telling me. She never had a funeral, never had a grave. I never even knew she existed to grieve her. Jesus. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm sorry. I can't imagine what you're going through. I need to go back to Cypress Hollow. There are things there. Letters Lorraine wrote to Claire. Things I need to see. Mrs. Whitmore, that's an active crime scene now. I can't let you contaminate potential evidence. It's my property, Sheriff, and more importantly, it's where a woman spent 32 years imprisoned because my husband was too cowardly to tell me the truth. I understand your feelings, but no, you don't understand. You can't possibly understand. I looked around the apartment that suddenly felt like another prison, Another carefully constructed lie. Sheriff, that woman in the hospital is the only person alive who shared Claire with me. She's the only one who knows what it feels like to love a daughter we both lost. I need to see how she lived, what Cameron did to her. Mrs. Whitmore, I'll make you a deal. Let me meet you there this afternoon. We'll go through the house together, properly document everything for the investigation. But I need to be there to make sure we handle this correctly. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet apartment thinking about two daughters, the one I'd raised and loved and buried, and the one I'd carried and lost without ever knowing she'd existed. Claire, who'd lived 19 years believing I was her biological mother, never knowing that her real mother was writing her letters from a prison in Arkansas. And my unnamed daughter, who died in my womb and been incinerated like medical waste while I lay unconscious, unaware that I was supposed to be grieving. Cameron had robbed us all. Me of the chance to mourn my real daughter, Lorraine of the chance to raise hers, and Claire of the chance to know the truth about her origins. But as I prepared to drive back to Cypress Hollow, I realized that the dead couldn't be helped by justice or truth or belated recognition. The living, however, still had choices to make, and Lorraine Dufresne had paid enough for Cameron's crimes. It was time to decide what kind of justice was possible when the perpetrator was dead and the victims were still trying to figure out who they'd been before they learned the truth. The drive back to Cypress Hollow felt different in daylight, less mysterious and more tragic. I could see the care that had gone into maintaining the property: fresh gravel on the driveway, well-tended gardens, a mailbox painted in cheerful yellow that looked recently refreshed. This wasn't neglect or abandonment. This was someone making the best of an impossible situation, creating beauty in a prison. Sheriff Cooper was waiting for me when I arrived, along with a younger deputy and a woman in a state forensics jacket who was photographing everything with methodical precision. Mrs. Whitmore, this is Deputy Martinez and Investigator Susan Wells from the Arkansas State Police. They're going to help us document everything properly. I nodded, but my attention was focused on the house itself. Up close, I could see details that had escaped my notice during yesterday's crisis. Wind chimes hanging from the porch eaves, herb gardens planted in neat rows beside the kitchen windows, bird feeders positioned to be visible from inside the house. Lorraine made this place a home, I said, more to myself than to the others. Ma'am? Deputy Martinez looked confused. Nothing. It's just, I expected it to look more like a prison. Sheriff Cooper studied my face carefully. Mrs. Whitmore, before we go inside, I need to prepare you. We've been through the house preliminarily, and there are things you're going to find difficult to see. More difficult than learning my entire marriage was built on a lie? Different kind of difficult. He led me up the front steps and through a door that opened into a living room that took my breath away. The walls were covered with photographs, hundreds of them, arranged chronologically from Claire's infancy through her college years. It was like walking into a shrine dedicated to my daughter's life, maintained by a woman who'd never been allowed to be part of it. But it wasn't just photographs. There were newspaper clippings from Claire's high school softball achievements, photocopied programs from her piano recitals, printouts of the dean's list announcements from her college newsletter. Every milestone, every achievement, every public moment of Claire's life had been documented and displayed with the devotion of someone who had no other way to participate in her daughter's existence. How did she get all of this? I whispered. According to her statement yesterday, your husband brought her everything. Photos, newspaper clippings, school newsletters. He apparently documented your daughter's entire life for Ms. Dufresne's benefit. I moved through the room slowly, studying pictures of Claire that I'd taken myself, birthday parties in our Memphis house, Christmas mornings, family vacations. Seeing them here, in this context, felt like discovering that someone had been watching my family from the shadows for 3 decades. Mrs. Whitmore, Investigator Wells said gently, there's more. The bedroom has been set up as a sort of memorial space. You should see it, but it's going to be emotional. The bedroom was small but carefully arranged, with a single twin bed covered in a quilt that looked handmade. But what dominated the space was a dresser that had been converted into a display area for what appeared to be gifts never given. Wrapped presents, dozens of them, each labeled with dates spanning 32 years. Happy first birthday, Claire. Merry Christmas, 1995. Love, Mom. High school graduation. So proud of you. The packages were wrapped in paper that had yellowed with age, ribbons that had faded, gift tags written in Lorraine's careful handwriting. She bought her presents, I said, my voice barely audible. For 32 years, she bought Claire presents and wrapped them and never got to give them. Mrs. Whitmore, there's something else. Sheriff Cooper opened the closet door to reveal a cedar chest. She said you'd want to see this. Inside the chest were the letters Lorraine had mentioned in her note to me. Hundreds of them, organized by year and carefully preserved. Letters to a daughter she'd never been allowed to contact, written by a mother who'd been forced to love from a distance. I picked up one at random, dated December 1998. My dearest Claire, you turned 5 today. Cameron brought me pictures of your birthday party, and you looked so happy wearing that purple dress with the sparkles. You've lost your 2 front teeth, and your smile is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. I bought you a dollhouse for your birthday. It's sitting on my dresser, wrapped in paper with balloons on it, waiting for a day when I can give it to you. I know you'll probably never see it, but I wanted you to know that somewhere, someone was thinking about you on your special day. Cameron says you're learning to read, that you love books about animals. I've been reading children's books too, trying to imagine what stories you might like. There's a library in the next town over, and sometimes when Cameron visits, he brings me books that he thinks you might enjoy. I wonder if you look like me when I was your age. Cameron says you have my eyes, but Daisy's determination. I'm glad you have her strength. You'll need it in this world. I love you, sweet girl, even though you don't know I exist. Your birth mother, Lorraine. I set the letter down with shaking hands and picked up another one, this one from Claire's senior year of high school. My beautiful daughter, you graduate tomorrow. Cameron showed me pictures of you in your cap and gown, and I cried for an hour. You're so beautiful, so poised, so ready for the world. Daisy has raised you to be everything I hoped you would become. You're going to study biology at Ole Miss. Cameron says you want to be a veterinarian, that you've always loved animals. I'm so proud of you for choosing a career that helps others. I wish I could be there tomorrow, sitting in the back row, watching you walk across that stage. I wish I could tell you how proud I am, how much I've loved watching you grow up through pictures and stories and Cameron's monthly reports. You're 18 now, legally an adult. Sometimes I wonder if I could contact you now, if I could tell you the truth without destroying the life Daisy has built for you. But I'm afraid. Afraid you'd hate me for giving you away. Afraid you'd hate Daisy for unknowingly raising another woman's child. Afraid the truth would cause more pain than comfort. So I'll keep loving you from this distance. Keep writing letters you'll never read. Keep hoping that somehow you know you have another mother who thinks about you every single day. Congratulations on your graduation, my darling girl. All my love, Lorraine. There were hundreds more. Birthday letters, Christmas letters, letters about ordinary days when Lorraine just wanted to tell her daughter about the book she was reading, or the birds she'd seen outside her window, or her hopes for Claire's future. 32 years of maternal love with no outlet except paper and ink. Mrs. Whitmore, Investigator Wells said softly, we've found evidence of the monthly visits you mentioned. Grocery receipts, medical supply deliveries, even receipts for photo developing services. Your husband documented everything meticulously. He was always organized, I said automatically, then felt sick for defending any aspect of Cameron's behavior. There's also this. Deputy Martinez handed me a folder containing what appeared to be financial records. Bank statements showing regular cash withdrawals, always the same amount, always on the third Saturday of each month for 32 years. The statement showed a pattern that made my stomach clench. $850 withdrawn monthly, like clockwork, from an account I'd never known existed. 32 years of payments to maintain Lorraine's imprisonment, funded by money that should have been supporting our family. How much? I asked. Over 32 years, how much did he spend keeping her here? Investigator Wells consulted her calculator. Approximately $326,000, not including the initial property purchase and house renovation. Over $300,000 spent maintaining a secret that had destroyed multiple lives. Money that could have paid for Claire's college education, that could have funded our retirement, that could have done any number of beneficial things instead of financing a decades-long conspiracy. Mrs. Whitmore, Sheriff Cooper said, we're going to need you to make some decisions about Ms. Dufresne's situation. She has no legal identity documents, no social security card, no driver's license. Technically, she doesn't exist in the system. What do you mean? Your husband apparently confiscated her identification documents in 1993 and never returned them. She's been a non-person for 32 years. No credit history, no medical records in her own name, no way to prove her identity or access services. I looked around the bedroom that had served as Lorraine's entire world for 3 decades. The wrapped presents never given, the letters never sent, the photographs of a daughter she'd loved but never known. What happens to her now? I asked. That depends on you, Mrs. Whitmore. You own this property. You inherited responsibility for Ms. Dufresne's situation along with everything else your husband left behind. I thought about Lorraine lying in the hospital bed, 89 years old and broken-hipped, with no family except the daughter who died believing someone else was her mother. No resources except whatever charity I might choose to provide. Sheriff, I need to ask you something. If we pursue criminal charges posthumously, if we investigate this as kidnapping and fraud and all the other crimes Cameron committed, what happens to Lorraine? She'd be a victim, not a perpetrator. But the investigation would be very public, very invasive. Her entire life would become evidence in a criminal case. I looked at the letters scattered around me, thinking about a woman who'd already paid for Cameron's crimes with 32 years of her life. And if we don't pursue charges, then Ms. Dufresne remains your responsibility, and this whole situation disappears into whatever privacy you choose to give it. Some justice, I was learning, came with choices that had no good answers. But some responsibilities were inherited along with property, whether you wanted them or not. And some prisons required someone to hold the keys, even after the person who'd built them was dead. I spent 3 hours in that house, moving through rooms that told the story of a life suspended in time. The kitchen contained cookbooks with recipes carefully marked Claire's favorites, based on information Cameron had shared during his monthly visits. The bathroom medicine cabinet held medications for conditions I recognized: arthritis, high blood pressure, depression. Prescriptions filled under assumed names at pharmacies Cameron must have driven to in different towns. But it was the small bedroom that had apparently served as Lorraine's office that revealed the full scope of what Cameron had stolen from both of us. The walls were covered with calendars spanning 32 years, each date marking something significant in Claire's life that Lorraine had commemorated from her prison. First steps, first words, first day of school, soccer games, piano recitals, graduation, college acceptance, even the date of the car accident that had killed the daughter she'd never been allowed to know. May 15th, 2008, Claire's accident, was written in red ink on the calendar from that year, surrounded by black marker as if Lorraine had been observing some kind of private mourning ritual. Mrs. Whitmore, Investigator Wells said, finding me staring at the calendars, we've documented everything we need for our reports. The question now is what you want to do going forward. I looked around the room one more time, taking in the evidence of 32 years of maternal love that had no outlet except secret documentation and private grief. I want to see Lorraine. I need to talk to her before I make any decisions. The drive back to the hospital gave me time to process what I'd learned. Cameron hadn't just switched babies and imprisoned Lorraine. He'd created an elaborate system to torture her with proximity to the daughter she could never claim. Every photo he'd shared, every update about Claire's life, every birthday and Christmas that passed without contact had been a deliberate reminder of what Lorraine had lost by agreeing to his bargain. But he'd tortured me too, in ways I was only beginning to understand. Every time I'd mourned my inability to have more children after Claire, every time I'd wondered why pregnancy had been so difficult, every time I'd felt guilty for not being able to give Cameron a larger family, all of that suffering had been based on a lie. I hadn't failed to conceive again because of medical problems from Claire's birth. I'd failed to conceive because Cameron knew the truth about what had happened during that delivery, and he'd been too guilty to risk going through it again. Lorraine was awake when I arrived at her room, staring out the window at the parking lot with the expression of someone who'd spent decades looking at things she couldn't reach. "How was the house?" she asked, as I settled into the visitor's chair. "Like a museum dedicated to a daughter you were never allowed to love properly." She nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "I tried to make it a home, but it was always a tomb, a place to keep memories of a life I couldn't participate in." "Lorraine, I need to ask you something directly. In 32 years, did you ever try to leave? Did you ever attempt to contact authorities or get help?" She was quiet for a long time, considering her answer carefully. 3 times, once in 1997, once in 2003, and once in 2010. "What happened? The first time, I walked to the main road and tried to flag down a car. Cameron had told the neighbors, the few who lived within miles, that I was his mentally ill sister who sometimes wandered off and became confused. When the state trooper brought me back to the house, Cameron explained that I'd had an episode and needed to take my medication. "And you didn't tell the trooper the truth?" I tried to. I said I was being held against my will, that I had a daughter who didn't know I existed. But Daisy, Lorraine looked at me with something that might have been pity. I had no identification, no proof of who I was, no way to substantiate any of my claims, and Cameron had documentation showing I was his dependent sister with a history of psychiatric problems. He forged that documentation? Of course he did. Cameron thought of everything. Lorraine adjusted her position in the hospital bed, wincing as the movement aggravated her hip injury. The second time I tried to leave in 2003, I made it to the library in the next town over. I was going to use their computer to research how to contact Claire directly, but Cameron tracked me down within hours. How? He'd been monitoring my reading habits, knew I was learning about internet research and social media. He'd prepared for the possibility that I might try to use technology to reach Claire. When I didn't show up for his monthly visit and he found the house empty, he called the library and described me to the staff. Small towns, Daisy. Everyone knows everyone else's business. What about 2010? Lorraine's expression grew darker. That was after Claire died. I'd been grieving for 2 years, writing letters to a daughter who was already in the ground, and I couldn't bear it anymore. I took everything. All the letters I'd written, all the presents I'd bought, all the documentation of the 32 years I'd spent loving her from a distance. I was going to drive to Memphis and leave it all on her grave. But you didn't have a car. I stole Cameron's truck when he was in the house, drove it 18 miles toward the interstate before I realized I didn't know where Claire was buried, didn't even know her married name or whether she'd been cremated or interred. Lorraine wiped tears from her eyes. I sat in that truck on the side of Highway 40, holding a box of letters to a dead daughter I'd never known, and realized I had nowhere to go with my grief. "So you went back." Cameron was waiting for me. He didn't say a word, just took the truck keys and drove me home. But after that, he started bringing me antidepressants along with the groceries, said I needed to accept my situation and stop trying to disrupt the natural order of things. I thought about the timeline of Claire's death and Lorraine's attempted escape, about 2 mothers grieving the same daughter in isolation from each other while the man responsible for their suffering managed their pain like a corporate problem requiring efficient solutions. Lorraine, why didn't you hate me? All those years, knowing I was raising your daughter while you were imprisoned for giving birth to her, how did you not resent me? She smiled sadly. Because hating you would have meant hating Claire's happiness. Every photo Cameron showed me proved that you were a wonderful mother, that she was thriving in ways she never would have with me at 25. How could I resent you for giving my daughter everything I couldn't provide? But you could have provided it if Cameron hadn't. No, Daisy, I couldn't. Lorraine's voice was firm now, stronger than I'd heard it since we'd met. I was a mess in 1993, depressed, broke, working minimum wage jobs and barely feeding myself. Cameron didn't just steal Claire from me. He stole her from a life of poverty and instability and gave her to a mother who could love her properly. That wasn't his choice to make. No, it wasn't. But it was the right choice for Claire, even if he made it for the wrong reasons. Lorraine reached for my hand, her fingers warm and surprisingly strong. Daisy, I've had 32 years to think about this. Cameron was a monster who destroyed our lives to protect his secret. But you were an angel who loved my daughter with everything you had. I squeezed her hand, feeling the weight of shared grief and mutual recognition. What do you want now, Lorraine? What would justice look like for you? I want to die knowing that Claire was loved. That's all I've ever wanted. She paused, studying my face. And I want you to stop carrying guilt for something you didn't know about. You were as much Cameron's victim as I was, but I got to raise her. I got 32 years of being her mother. And I got 32 years of loving her from a distance, which was more than I deserved after selling her for money. Lorraine's grip on my hand tightened. Daisy, we both lost daughters to Cameron's lies. Your biological child died, and you never got to mourn her. My biological child lived, and I never got to raise her. But Claire herself, our Claire, was loved every single day of her life by the mother she deserved. I sat in that hospital room, holding hands with the woman whose existence had shattered my understanding of my own life, and realized that some forms of justice couldn't be achieved through legal proceedings or criminal investigations. Some wounds were too old and too deep to heal through punishment, but some healing was still possible through recognition, through acknowledgement, through the simple act of two mothers honoring the daughter they'd both loved in their own ways. "Lorraine, I have a proposal for you." "I'm listening." "I'm going to sell the farm. Use the money to make sure you have proper medical care and a place to live with dignity for whatever time you have left. But first, I want to do something Cameron never let us do." "What's that?" "I want us to grieve our daughters together. All of them. Claire, who we both loved, and my unnamed baby, who died without ever being mourned." For the first time since I'd met her, Lorraine smiled with genuine joy. "I would be honored to help you grieve, Daisy. It's the least I can do for the woman who raised my daughter when I couldn't." Some families, I was learning, were created by circumstances rather than choice, and some justice was found in choosing love over revenge, even when revenge would have been easier. 2 weeks later, I found myself standing in Lorraine's hospital room with a wheelchair and a plan that would have seemed impossible when this nightmare first began. Her hip surgery had been successful, but at 89, recovery was slow and complicated by decades of limited medical care. "Where are we going?" she asked as I helped her transfer from the bed to the wheelchair. "Memphis. To see Claire." Lorraine's face went pale. "Daisy, I don't think I'm ready for that." "Neither am I. But we're going anyway." The drive from Arkansas to Memphis took 3 hours, most of it in comfortable silence broken only by Lorraine's occasional directions when she spotted something she wanted to comment on. A farm that reminded her of her childhood in Louisiana. A church that looked like one she'd attended as a girl. Ordinary observations that proved she was still capable of finding beauty in the world despite 32 years of imposed isolation. I'd called ahead to Elmwood Cemetery, explaining our unusual situation to a patient administrator who'd arranged for privacy and assistance. Claire was buried in the section I'd chosen for its mature oak trees and peaceful atmosphere under a granite headstone that read simply, "Claire Whitmore, 1993-2008, beloved daughter, forever in our hearts." As I pushed Lorraine's wheelchair along the paved path toward Claire's grave, I watched her face transform. The resignation and wariness that had characterized her expression since we'd met was replaced by something approaching peace. "She's here," Lorraine whispered as we approached the headstone. "She's here." I positioned the wheelchair so Lorraine could reach the headstone, then knelt beside her. For several minutes we sat in silence, two mothers at their daughter's grave, each processing grief that had been complicated by decades of deception. "Claire," Lorraine said finally, her voice barely audible, "this is Daisy, your real mother, the woman who loved you every day of your life. And this is Lorraine," I added, my voice breaking, "your birth mother, the woman who loved you from a distance but never stopped thinking about you." Lorraine reached into the bag she'd brought and withdrew one of the wrapped presents from her bedroom at Cypress Hollow, a package labeled "Happy 16th Birthday" that had been sitting on her dresser for 3 years, waiting for an opportunity that had never come. "I brought you a present," she said, placing the faded package against the headstone. "I know it's late, but I wanted you to finally have something from me." I watched this woman, who'd been denied the right to grieve publicly, perform the simple act of giving her daughter a gift, and felt something shift in my understanding of what family could mean. "Lorraine, there's something else I need to do here." From my purse, I withdrew a small granite marker I'd commissioned from the same company that had created Claire's headstone. It was tiny, barely 6 inches long, but it bore an inscription that had taken me weeks to finalize. "Baby Whitmore, March 14th, 1993. Born sleeping. Loved before birth, mourned after truth, finally remembered." I placed the small marker next to Claire's headstone and knelt between them, my hands touching both pieces of granite. "My daughter," I said to the smaller marker, "I never got to hold you, never got to name you, never got to say goodbye. Your father robbed me of the chance to grieve you properly, but I'm grieving you now. I'm so sorry I didn't know you existed. I'm so sorry you died alone." Then I turned to Claire's headstone. "And you, my beautiful girl, I raised you and loved you and was proud of you every single day. Learning that you weren't biologically mine doesn't change any of that. You were my daughter in every way that mattered. Lorraine was crying now, her tears falling onto the wrapped birthday present she'd placed at the grave. "Claire, I want you to know that Daisy was everything I hoped she would be. She gave you piano lessons and helped you with homework and cheered at your softball games and held you when you were sick. She was the mother you deserved, the mother I couldn't be when you were born." We sat there for over an hour, two women who'd been denied the chance to grieve together, finally sharing the burden of loving and losing the same daughter. When other visitors approached, they gave us a respectful distance, perhaps sensing the intensity of our shared mourning. "Daisy," Lorraine said, as we prepared to leave, "what happens now? Now we figure out how to live with the truth, together." Together? I thought about the decision I'd been wrestling with since discovering Lorraine's existence, about the choice between justice and mercy, between punishment and healing. I've been thinking about what Cameron owed you for 32 years of imprisonment, what he owed me for 32 years of lies, what he owed our daughters for the chances he stole from all of us. And he owed us the opportunity to know each other, to share our love for Claire, to grieve together instead of separately. I looked back at the grave where my two daughters rested, one in body, one in memory, both finally acknowledged. "Lorraine, I'm selling Cypress Hollow, but I'm not abandoning you. I want you to come to Memphis. I want us to take care of each other." "Daisy, you don't owe me anything." "Yes, I do. I owe you the chance to tell me stories about Claire's birth, about what she was like as a newborn before Cameron took her away from you. I owe you the chance to read the letters you wrote to her. I owe you the chance to be part of her memory in the way you were never allowed to be part of her life." Lorraine was quiet for a long time, processing this unexpected offer of connection rather than separation. What would that look like? I don't know yet, but I know that pushing you away won't bring back the daughters we lost or undo the lies Cameron told. And Lorraine, you're the only other person alive who understands what it means to love Claire Whitmore. Even though I gave her away, because you gave her to someone who could love her properly, because you spent 32 years grieving a child you were never allowed to claim, because you wrote her letters she never received and bought her presents she never opened and celebrated her achievements from a distance. I reached over and took Lorraine's hand, feeling the strange comfort of touching someone who shared my deepest loss. Cameron stole our chances to be a family in any normal sense, but he couldn't steal the love we both had for Claire. And maybe, if we're brave enough, we can build something new from that shared love. A family of survivors, a family of mothers who both lost the same daughter and found each other too late to save her, but not too late to honor her. As we drove away from the cemetery, I looked in the rearview mirror at the grave where both my daughters now rested, one in body, one finally in memory, and realized that some kinds of healing required more courage than justice. Some forgiveness wasn't about forgetting the harm that had been done, but about choosing to build something meaningful from the wreckage. And some families were created not by blood or law, but by the simple recognition that certain kinds of love were too valuable to waste on hatred, even when hatred would have been justified. Cameron had created a prison for Lorraine and a lie for me, but he hadn't been able to destroy our capacity to choose love over revenge, connection over isolation, shared healing over separate suffering. That choice, I was beginning to understand, was the only justice that mattered. It was also the only inheritance worth passing on. The real estate agent assured me that Cypress Hollow would sell quickly. 600 acres of Arkansas farmland, with a well-maintained house and good road access, were increasingly rare. The asking price of $420,000 would more than cover Lorraine's medical care and housing for whatever years she had left. But cleaning out the house proved more emotionally complex than I'd anticipated. I'd arranged for Lorraine to stay in a rehabilitation facility in Memphis while her hip healed, giving us both time to process what our new relationship might look like. But before I could close that chapter of her life, I needed to go through 32 years of accumulated memories and decide what was worth preserving. The wrapped presents came home with me, dozens of them, birthday and Christmas gifts that Lorraine had bought for Claire over the years, never knowing if she'd ever have the opportunity to give them. I unwrapped them carefully in my Memphis apartment. A dollhouse from when Claire was 5, books about marine biology from her teenage years when Cameron had reported her interest in becoming a veterinarian, even a college graduation gift that Lorraine had purchased months before Claire's death. Each gift revealed how carefully Lorraine had listened to Cameron's reports about Claire's interests and development, how she'd tried to maintain a connection to her daughter through the only means available to her. The letters were more difficult to handle. There were hundreds of them, one for every week of Claire's life, chronicling Lorraine's growth from a frightened 25-year-old into a mature woman who'd learned to find meaning in loving someone from a distance. I read them in chronological order, watching Lorraine's handwriting evolve, her insights deepen, her maternal love develop in isolation. But it was the final batch of letters, written after Claire's death, that broke my heart completely. My dearest Claire, it's been 6 months since the accident, and I still write to you every week because I don't know how to stop. Cameron says grief gets easier with time, but I think he's wrong. I think it just becomes more familiar. I dream about you sometimes. In my dreams, I was allowed to be your mother properly. I taught you to braid your hair and helped you with math homework and embarrassed you by cheering too loudly at your softball games. In my dreams, you knew I existed and you loved me anyway. But when I wake up, I remember that my dreams are selfish. You had Daisy, who was everything a mother should be. You had love and stability and encouragement and all the things I couldn't have given you when you were born. I spent 19 years loving you from a distance. Now I'll spend the rest of my life loving your memory the same way. Your invisible mother, Lorraine. I set the letter down and looked around my apartment, which was now filled with evidence of a parallel maternal existence I'd never known about. Lorraine hadn't just been imprisoned at Cypress Hollow. She'd been forced to develop a complete emotional life around a daughter she could never claim, never comfort, never celebrate with directly. My phone rang. The rehabilitation facility calling to say that Lorraine was ready for discharge and asking about her placement options. I'll be there this afternoon to pick her up, I told the social worker. Mrs. Whitmore, we need to discuss Ms. Dufresne's ongoing care needs. She's 89, recovering from major surgery, and according to her intake paperwork, she has no family or support system. She has me. There was a pause. Are you family? It's complicated. 2 hours later, I was helping Lorraine transfer from a wheelchair into my car, her few belongings packed into a single suitcase that contained everything she owned, apart from what we'd left at Cypress Hollow. Where am I going? She asked, as I adjusted the passenger seat for her comfort. Home. With me. Daisy, you don't have to. Yes, I do. Not because I owe you, but because we're both too old and too tired to live alone with this much grief. I'd spent the past 3 weeks converting my spare bedroom into a space suitable for an elderly woman with mobility limitations. The bed was lower, the lighting was better, and I'd installed grab bars in the adjacent bathroom. But more importantly, I'd created a space where Lorraine could display some of the photographs and mementos from her years at Cypress Hollow, a way for her to maintain connection to her memories while building new ones. Daisy, Lorraine said, as I gave her the tour of what would be her room. This is more kindness than I deserve. Stop saying that. You spent 32 years paying for a choice you made when you were young and scared. That's enough punishment for anyone. I helped her get settled, then made tea and sat with her in the living room that now contained photographs from both of our relationships with Claire, my family snapshots mixed with the formal portraits that Cameron had shared with Lorraine over the years. Tell me about the day she was born, I said. Lorraine looked surprised. Your daughter or mine? Yours. I want to know what Claire was like as a newborn before Cameron brought her to me. And so Lorraine told me about March 7th, 1993, about a labor that had been frightening and painful for a young woman with no family support, about a baby who'd been born healthy but small, about the few hours she'd spent holding her daughter before Cameron arrived with his proposition. She had the strongest grip, Lorraine said, smiling at the memory. When she wrapped her tiny fingers around mine, I thought, this child is going to be a fighter. And she was, wasn't she? She was fierce, stubborn, determined, never backed down from anything. I thought about Claire's teenage years, about the arguments we'd had about curfews and college choices and boys. Sometimes I wondered where that iron will came from. Now I know. What was she like as a little girl? And so I told Lorraine about Claire's childhood, about the way she'd insisted on reading herself to sleep even before she could actually read, about her obsession with collecting rocks that she was convinced were dinosaur fossils, about the elaborate tea parties she'd hosted for her stuffed animals every Sunday afternoon. She would have loved you, I said. If she'd known you existed, she would have been proud to have two mothers who loved her. Do you really believe that? I do. Claire had the biggest heart of anyone I've ever known. She would have understood that love multiplied doesn't equal love divided. We talked until evening, sharing memories and stories and filling in the gaps in each other's knowledge of Claire's life. When Lorraine grew tired, I helped her to bed and then sat alone in my living room, looking at the photographs that now told a more complete story of my daughter's existence. The next morning, I made a decision that surprised even me. Lorraine, I want to ask you something. What would you think about visiting Dr. Brennan's grave? Dr. Marcus Brennan, the doctor who'd helped Cameron orchestrate the baby switch, had died 10 years earlier. I'd found his obituary during my research into the conspiracy, along with details about his struggle with gambling addiction and the financial problems that had made him vulnerable to Cameron's bribery. Why would we do that? Because he was part of this story too. Because understanding what happened means understanding all the people who made choices that affected our lives. Daisy, are you sure you want to dig deeper into this? I'm sure I want to close every door that needs closing. I want to understand the complete truth so we can both move forward without wondering what other secrets are waiting to be discovered. An hour later, we were standing at Dr. Brennan's grave in a Memphis cemetery, reading a headstone that described him as a beloved physician and father of 3. He had children, Lorraine observed. 3 daughters. I looked them up. All successful adults now, 2 doctors and a lawyer. So his choice to help Cameron funded his daughter's education and gave them opportunities they might not have had otherwise. I looked at the inscription praising his dedication to his patients and his community. People are complicated, Lorraine. Dr. Brennan committed a terrible crime, but he also delivered hundreds of healthy babies and saved countless lives during his career. Does that excuse what he did? No, but it explains why Cameron was able to convince him to do it. Desperate people make choices they'd never make otherwise. We stood there in silence, thinking about the doctor who'd helped steal my biological daughter and replace her with Lorraine's, who'd committed fraud to help a friend but had probably justified it as helping 2 families avoid tragedy. What do you think he would say if he could see us now? Lorraine asked. I think he'd be relieved that his crime ultimately led to something good, that 2 women who should have been enemies found a way to become family instead. As we walked back to the car, Lorraine reached for my arm, not just for physical support, but for the comfort of connection. Daisy, do you think Claire knows? Do you think she understands what we're trying to do? I thought about my daughter, about the young woman who'd approached life with curiosity and compassion, who'd always been drawn to healing rather than hurting. I think she'd be proud of us for choosing love over anger, for building something beautiful from the wreckage Cameron left behind, even if it means forgiving people who don't deserve forgiveness, especially if it means that. Claire always believed that people were capable of becoming better than their worst choices. And as we drove home to the apartment where 2 mothers were learning to share the memory of one extraordinary daughter, I realized that forgiveness wasn't about excusing harmful behavior. It was about refusing to let that behavior define the rest of your story. 6 months after bringing Lorraine home, I received a call that I'd been dreading. Dr. Patterson from the oncology clinic, where Lorraine had been receiving treatment, spoke with the gentle directness that doctors use when delivering news that can't be softened. Mrs. Whitmore, the latest scans show significant progression. We're looking at weeks rather than months. I thanked him and hung up, then sat in my kitchen staring at the teacups I'd set out for our afternoon ritual. Earl Grey for me, chamomile for Lorraine, with the small almond cookies she'd developed a fondness for since moving to Memphis. Lorraine was napping in her room, but when I knocked softly, she opened her eyes immediately, alert in the way that sick people learn to be. It's time, isn't it? She asked, reading my expression. Dr. Patterson says a few weeks, maybe less. She nodded, as if confirming something she'd already suspected. I'm ready, Daisy. I've been ready for a long time. What do you need? What can I do? There's something I want to ask you, something I've been thinking about since we visited Claire's grave. I sat on the edge of her bed, taking her hand in mine. In the months we'd lived together, her hands had become more fragile, the skin paper-thin and marked with the bruises that appeared easily and healed slowly. When I die, she said, would you bury me next to Claire? I know it's asking a lot, and I know some people might think it's inappropriate, but yes, I'll bury you next to Claire. You're her mother too. You have every right to rest beside her." Lorraine's eyes filled with tears of relief. "I was afraid you'd say it was too complicated, that people wouldn't understand." "Let them not understand. We know what's right." Over the next 3 weeks, Lorraine declined rapidly but peacefully. We spent our time talking about Claire, sharing stories and memories that painted a more complete picture of our daughter's life and personality. Lorraine told me about the dreams she'd had over the years, imaginary conversations with the daughter she'd never been allowed to know. I shared the small details of Claire's childhood that Cameron had never thought to include in his monthly reports, the way she hummed while doing homework, her habit of collecting interesting buttons, her fear of thunderstorms that had lasted until she was 12. "Daisy," Lorraine said one afternoon while we sat in the living room watching birds at the feeder I'd installed outside her window, "I need to tell you something about Cameron." "What about him?" "In all the years he visited me, in all the conversations we had about Claire, and about what he'd done to both of us, he never once asked for forgiveness. Not once." I considered this, thinking about my husband's final words in the hospital, his desperate request that I promise never to go to Cypress Hollow. He knew what he'd done was unforgivable. "Yes, but Daisy, there's something else. In his last few visits before the stroke, he started talking about you differently." "How do you mean?" "He said he'd ruined your life twice, once when your real daughter died, and again when he stole your chance to grieve her. He said giving you my daughter hadn't made up for what he'd taken from you. It had just compounded the lie." Lorraine shifted in her chair, trying to find a more comfortable position as the cancer made movement increasingly difficult. "He said he'd spent 32 years watching you love Claire with everything you had, and every moment of joy you took in being her mother was also a moment when you were being denied the truth about your own child." "What did you tell him?" "I told him that love doesn't lie, even when people do, that your love for Claire was real, regardless of biology, that being a mother isn't about whose DNA a child carries, it's about who shows up every day to love them unconditionally." I thought about Cameron's final days, about the fear in his eyes when he'd made me promise to stay away from Cypress Hollow. Had he been protecting his secret, or had he been protecting me from a truth he knew would destroy my understanding of my own life? "Lorraine, do you think he regretted what he did?" "I think he regretted getting caught in a lie that grew bigger than he could handle." "But Daisy, I don't think he regretted saving you from the grief of losing your biological daughter, even if the way he did it was monstrous." "That doesn't excuse—" "No, it doesn't excuse anything. Cameron was a coward who chose deception over truth, who imprisoned me to protect his secret, who robbed you of the chance to mourn your real child." Lorraine's voice was getting weaker, but her conviction remained strong. "But he also gave you 32 years of loving a daughter who needed you, and he gave me the peace of knowing my child was safe and cherished." "You're defending him?" "No, I'm trying to understand him. There's a difference." That evening, as I helped Lorraine prepare for bed, she asked me to bring her the small wooden box where she kept her most precious possessions. The last letter she'd written to Claire, the first photograph Cameron had ever shared of our daughter, and a silver locket that had belonged to her own mother. "I want you to have this," she said, pressing the locket into my palm. "It's not much, but it belonged to my mother, and her mother before that. I always planned to give it to Claire when she was 18. Lorraine, this is too precious. Please, let it be something of mine that becomes something of yours. Let it be a way for our families to stay connected even after I'm gone." 3 days later, Lorraine died peacefully in her sleep. I found her in the morning, looking serene in a way she'd rarely appeared during her waking hours. Her breathing had simply stopped sometime during the night, and she'd passed without pain or fear. The funeral was small, just me, the pastor from the church we'd started attending together, and Mrs. Patterson from the neighboring apartment who'd become fond of Lorraine during our evening walks when she'd still been strong enough for them. But as I watched her casket being lowered into the ground beside Claire's grave, I realized that the size of a funeral didn't determine the significance of a life. Lorraine had loved deeply and sacrificed enormously, had endured 32 years of imposed isolation with grace and dignity, had chosen forgiveness over bitterness, even when bitterness would have been justified. After the service, I stood alone between the two graves, reading the headstones that now told a more complete story. Claire Whitmore, 1993-2008, beloved daughter, forever in our hearts. Lorraine Dufresne, 1934-2024, mother who loved from a distance, finally at peace beside her daughter, and the tiny marker I'd placed 2 years earlier, baby Whitmore, March 14th, 1993, born sleeping, loved before birth, mourned after truth, finally remembered. 3 graves, 3 women whose lives had been shaped by one man's desperate choice to avoid facing the truth about loss and love, and the difference between protecting someone from pain and protecting yourself from consequences. Well, Claire, I said, addressing the middle gravestone, your birth mother and your adoptive mother are both here with you now, and somewhere, your biological sister, my real daughter, is finally being acknowledged and mourned. The wind picked up, rustling the oak leaves above us, and for a moment I could almost imagine it was Claire's voice, telling us that love was never wasted, that family was defined by choice rather than biology, that forgiveness was possible even when forgetting wasn't. Some stories, I realized, don't have endings. They just have moments when the people involved choose to stop letting the past define their future. But they also have moments when the living can finally honor the dead honestly, without the weight of lies or the burden of secrets that served no one except the person too cowardly to face the truth. Lorraine had found peace at last, lying beside the daughter she'd never been allowed to claim in life. And I had found something I'd never expected, the understanding that some families are created by tragedy rather than choice, but become real through the simple decision to love rather than blame, to heal rather than hurt, to build something meaningful from whatever broken pieces remain. 1 year after Lorraine's death, I returned to the cemetery with a purpose that had taken me months to fully understand. In my hands, I carried 3 items that represented the completion of a journey I'd never intended to take. A small memorial plaque, a wooden box containing Lorraine's letters to Claire, and a folder of legal documents that would ensure this story could never be repeated. The memorial plaque was made of the same granite as the headstones, small enough to sit between the 3 graves without disrupting the peaceful symmetry of their arrangement. The inscription had taken me weeks to perfect, in memory of all the mothers and daughters whose stories were silenced by secrets. May truth finally set them free. I placed it carefully in the center of the triangular arrangement formed by Claire's grave, Lorraine's grave, and my unnamed daughter's marker, creating a focal point that acknowledged not just our specific losses, but all the families destroyed by similar deceptions. The wooden box contained every letter Lorraine had written to Claire over 32 years, a complete record of maternal love expressed in isolation. I'd read them all multiple times, and each reading had taught me something new about the nature of love, sacrifice, and the different ways people survive impossible circumstances. Claire, I said, setting the box at the base of her headstone, your birth mother wrote to you every week for your entire life. She never got to send these letters, but I want them to be here with you now. They're proof that you were loved by 2 mothers who both wanted the best for you, even when we couldn't coordinate our love properly. The legal documents represented the most important decision I'd made since learning the truth about my family. I'd donated $500,000, the proceeds from selling Cypress Hollow plus most of my retirement savings, to establish the Claire and Lorraine Foundation for Medical Ethics and Patient Advocacy. The foundation would investigate cases where medical professionals might be vulnerable to financial pressure that could compromise their ethical judgment. It would provide legal support for patients and families who suspected medical fraud or malpractice. Most importantly, it would work to prevent other Dr. Brennans from making desperate choices that destroyed multiple families to solve short-term financial problems. I can't bring back the people we lost, I said, addressing all 3 graves, but I can try to prevent other families from living through what we experienced. As I arranged the documents at the memorial site, I thought about the letter I'd received the previous week from Dr. Brennan's daughter, who had read about the foundation in the Memphis newspaper and wanted to contribute to its work. Mrs. Whitmore, I learned about my father's involvement in your family's tragedy through your foundation's mission statement, and I want you to know how deeply sorry I am for the role he played in your suffering. I have struggled for years with the knowledge that my education was funded by money he received for participating in medical fraud. I would like to make a substantial donation to your foundation as a way of honoring the victims of my father's choices while working to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The donation sheet enclosed was for $200,000, exactly the amount Cameron had originally paid her father for his participation in the baby switch. Her letter had included a note that brought me to tears. I hope this can transform my father's worst choice into something that protects other families from similar harm. Some justice, I was learning, came full circle in ways that couldn't be planned or predicted. Lorraine, I said, turning to address her headstone, the woman whose education was funded by your suffering has chosen to honor your memory by helping prevent others from facing similar choices. I think you'd appreciate the irony. I sat cross-legged on the grass between the graves, something I'd started doing during my monthly visits over the past year. The groundskeepers had learned to recognize me and gave me space during these conversations with my unusual family. I've been thinking about forgiveness, I continued, addressing all 3 graves simultaneously. For months, people have asked me how I can forgive Cameron for what he did to us, how I could forgive Lorraine for selling her daughter, how I could forgive Dr. Brennan for participating in fraud. The truth was more complex than most people wanted to hear. I didn't forgive any of them because they deserved it. I forgave them because carrying that anger was destroying my ability to honor the love we shared for Claire. Because staying angry at dead people is like being trapped in a prison where you're both the guard and the prisoner. A family with young children had arrived at a nearby grave, and their laughter reminded me of Sunday afternoons when Claire was small, when our biggest concerns were homework completion and bedtime negotiations. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean that what happened was acceptable. Cameron's choices were monstrous. Dr. Brennan's participation was criminal, and Lorraine's decision to sell her daughter, even under desperate circumstances, had consequences that lasted for decades. I pulled out the final item I'd brought, a photograph from Claire's 16th birthday party, one of the last pictures taken before the car accident that ended her life. She was laughing at something just outside the camera's range, her face radiant with the joy and confidence that had characterized her approach to life. What I've learned, I said, studying Claire's smile, is that love doesn't require perfect people or perfect circumstances. You were loved imperfectly by 3 mothers, me, Lorraine, and the daughter I carried who never got to meet you. But the love itself was real, even when the situation was built on lies. I placed the photograph where all 3 graves would have a view of it, secured under a small stone to prevent the wind from carrying it away. Claire, I raised you for 19 years believing you were biologically mine. Learning the truth didn't make those years less meaningful. It made them more precious because I understand now how easily they could have been lost. Lorraine, you loved Claire from a distance for 32 years, never knowing if you'd made the right choice in giving her away. You did make the right choice, even if Cameron made it for the wrong reasons. Claire had a good life, because you were brave enough to admit you couldn't provide one for her when she was born. And my unnamed daughter, my biological child who died before I could know her. You're part of this story too. Your death created the desperate circumstances that led to all the other choices. You deserved to be mourned, and now you are. The sun was beginning to set, painting the cemetery in golden light that made the granite headstones look warm and peaceful. I stood up, brushing grass stains from my clothes, and took one last look at the memorial I'd created. Tomorrow, I would return to my volunteer work with the foundation, helping other families navigate medical crises and advocacy challenges. Next week, I would attend a conference where I'd been invited to speak about medical ethics and patient rights. Next month, I would host the first annual scholarship dinner for nursing students who were committed to practicing medicine with integrity. But tonight, I would go home to the apartment where Lorraine and I had learned to be family, where her room remained exactly as she'd left it, where her teacup still sat in the kitchen cabinet next to mine. Some losses, I'd discovered, could be transformed into purposes that outlasted the people who suffered them. Some families could be built from tragedy and sustained by choice rather than obligation. And some love was strong enough to survive lies, betrayal, death, and the passage of time, not because it was perfect, but because it was genuine. Love doesn't live in the blood, I said, addressing the 3 graves one final time. It lives in the choice to stay when everything falls apart, and in the courage to honor even the pain that was stolen from us. As I walked away from the cemetery, I carried with me the weight of 3 generations of women who had loved imperfectly but completely, who had made choices that hurt and choices that healed, who had learned that family could be defined by loss as much as by joy. Some promises, I realized, were worth breaking when keeping them meant choosing secrets over truth. Some inheritances included not just property or money, but the responsibility to ensure that suffering could be transformed into service, that pain could become purpose, and that the worst choices people made didn't have to define the legacy they left behind. Cameron had kept his promise to the grave, protecting his secret until his dying breath. But I had chosen to break mine, and in doing so, had discovered that some truths were worth the price of shattering everything you thought you knew about your own life. The end. The end.